Hello, my name is Paul Arnold, sometimes known as the Stuttering Professor. I'm a strategic planner, facilitator and trainer, amongst other things. And I've read loads of books. I would say that I've not read them all, and I've summarised over 50 business-related books. And today I want to talk about this, Wilful Blindness, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Own Peril, by Margaret Heffernan. So, let's dig in the book a bit. Look, in a nutshell, in a time of massive information explosion, increased complexity, this VUCA world we all hear about, we run an increased risk of becoming blind to events, such as is quoted in the book, Enron, Bernard Madoff, the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, etc., etc. And this is caused by a number of factors, such as our brain's limited capacity to assimilate all information consciously. 2, our innate need to belong. 3, an over-focus on financial return versus people. And then fear of change and our obedience to authority. And clearly it takes incredible amount of courage and perseverance and outsider's perspective to dare to challenge a system that one's inside of. But organisations need to wake up to the threat of blindness and what that cost could be for them in the long run, and to set in place safeguards to help them see the truth more clearly. So let's dig into it a little bit more detail. Starts with a great quote from T.S. Eliot from Four Quartets. "Go, go, go," said the bird. "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." And the book explores a wide range of different factors that contribute to our often unconscious drive to be blind to certain situations. Let's dig into some of these. The limits of our minds. We are all naturally biased and cannot help it. And we are living in a massively overstimulated environment. Our brains are unable to cope with all the inputs, so it filters out what it sees to be irrelevant information. And the sheer complexities of many businesses means that they are impossible to fully manage or please. No one person can know everything that is happening inside an organisation. Now, maybe AI will start to change that. Furthermore, when we get tired, our brains slow down. Thus, a tired, experienced worker can start performing like an inexperienced person. They quote in the book, the abuse in Abu Ghraib was partly caused by tiredness that made them lose their moral compass. The soldiers were working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week for 40 consecutive days. They were literally drunk with exhaustion. Now, that doesn't excuse what they did, but it's partly to explain one of the causes of it. And we live in a deadline-driven culture. Adrenaline, that we're living under causes the closing down of parts of the brain, reducing our openness to new ideas. Hence, our culture of overworking is counterproductive and leads to greater errors. Let's think about our mindset. Now, we all have a map of reality that help guides our decision making and consequently our behaviour. And we naturally and unconsciously cluster together with other like-minded people and get fed what reflects our own point of view. And that further validates and strengthens our position. And it also means that we therefore ignore what does not fit with our map of reality. And I often use a phrase, we see what we believe, rather than believe what we see. So we're blind to the facts, and nice bit of research on that. Love is blind. When we love someone, we choose to ignore or discount their real fault. Only later on does that come much clearer to us. And some fMRI scanning has revealed parts of the brains used in critical judgment are switched off when we're deeply in love. Explains it all, doesn't it? And when presented with facts, we will often choose to ignore them rather than be swayed by them. Alan Greenspan is quoted within the book, was so seduced by his own model of the economic market that even when it was shown clear evidence he was wrong, he still blamed other reasons rather than his theories. Likewise, Tony Blair and weapons of mass destruction, the tobacco industry and the Catholic Church. So, contradictory information creates imbalance in the body. Neurochemicals are released that help delete or distort the divergent data, and information that supports the currently believed hypothesis is conversely rewarded with dopamine release. Let's move on. Having an outsider's point of view. It often takes a person who is outside the system or stays outside the system to see what others are blind to. For example, Steve Bolsin was the paediatric doctor who transferred to Bristol Royal Infirmary and uncovered the high child mortality rates in the unit there because he'd seen what the levels were elsewhere. The trouble is that whistleblowers are often outside the system. They are loners and they tend to be, at best on the fringe of groups. So they tend to be a bit like a Cassandra, the Greek myth. They see things, but they're not listened to, as they just don't have the authority or the credibility within the group to be listened to. Let's talk about the power of groups. We have an innate drive to be in groups. Physiologically, we are programmed to belong. That's part of our DNA. That's been part of our success as a species. And when we get rejected, the same chemicals associated with pain are released into our bodies. And when accepted into groups, opiates, pleasure hormones are released. So we get a very physiological, factors that drive us to belong and make sure that we don't try to get outside the system. And when we're in a team, it helps validate our self-image and our views, which we'll go to great lengths to protect. So it's no surprise that we'll try to stay inside groups and not be rejected. And this can lead to higher levels of compliance, sometimes even when it crosses our own moral boundaries. There's some great experiments done in the past. Ash did an experiment where he had a whole group of stooges in a room and one person, and they showed a series of lines, and they found in that experiment, we wanted to comply with others and would often say that a line was a different size from what our brains and our eyes were telling us merely to comply. Likewise, the famous Zimbardo prisoner warden experiment where students were randomly assigned in roles of playing being a prisoner or being a warden, and that experiment had to be stopped before it fully completed its time because people were so getting into their roles and were being so cruel to the prisoners. So we can sometimes lose our moral compass when we take on an identity. Therefore, the greater we identify with a group, the more influence that group norms will have upon us. And we become more like the people we spend the most time with. We unconsciously take on the group's values and beliefs. And I remember reading one time that it takes 7 years within a culture to completely absorb those culture and those values to become our own. Another example is the military creates situations of regular extreme exhaustion and tiredness, because actually what they found out is when the body gets tired, its ability to resist drops. Thus it's much easier to infiltrate the mind under such circumstances. And this is further exacerbated by regular assessments and threats of being expunged from that society. And we know that threat of rejection drives greater levels of compliance. Furthermore, people with low self-esteem, people pleasers, and people on the edge of teams, or especially those who have been previously rejected, are much more likely to be heavily compliant. Now let's look at bystander apathy. People will often turn a blind eye because everyone else is turning a blind eye. So we have that horrible case of Kitty Genovese, who was stabbed to death in the middle of a street in New York. 38 people witnessed the attack, but no one did anything about it, assuming someone else must have already called the police. There is the smoke-filled room experiment by Dali and Latani, where only 1 in 24 participants acted within 4 minutes when smoke started filling a room that they were filling a job application form in. Thus, the wisdom of the crowd can heavily influence our behaviour, as we blindly assume they must know more about this than we do. However, if people think they're the only one who could help, then 85% of people do something. But when it is seen as a shared problem, then only 33% take action. There was a nice experiment done, someone on top of a building, saying they were locked out. They shouted down to the street below, "Hey, can someone help me? I seem to be locked out." But when they said, "Hey, lady in the green dress, could you help me? I'm locked out," then actions would take place. So, ironically, the more people who witness an improper situation, the less likely anything will be done about it. Thus, the Enron collapse was not caused so much by a few corrupt people in the organisation, but the thousands of silent bystanders who did nothing. Now let's talk about our innate obedience to authority. Our compliance and hence willingness to turn a blind eye to things is partly driven by our learned response to obey authority figures. We learn this from the very youngest age, and it just gets part of the way that we act in life. So the very famous Stanley Milgram experiments, where he basically got innocent people to give shocks to people, and actually the shocks grew up to a really high level, I think of 400 volts, which would in theory kill them. But they just obeyed the person in the white coat who kept telling them, no, you must carry on with the experiment. Now, other experiments show that up to 25% of all plane crashes were caused by destructive obedience. In other words, not being prepared to challenge the authority of the captain. And other books like Black Box Thinking have also explored that idea as well. And part of this is caused by the way some leaders react when challenged. In the book, Heffernan talks about how one of her old BBC bosses used to throw telephones across the room. No wonder no one dared to challenge him. Another example was GM CEO Roger Smith, who was notorious for getting rid of people who dared to counter his point of view. Why would you challenge that? Which leads us into fear. We all fear. We fear change. It's common for people to adopt an ostrich-like approach to issues in the hope they may go away, because we don't know what's on the other side of actually challenging that. And sadly, often in relationships, the betrayed partner or, say, parent of an abused child will often hide away from the facts as they fear an uncertain future. So better to be where they are than what would happen on the outside, which they know nothing about it. And survival means people will cling to, therefore, a less than perfect situation. And research has shown that people tend to downplay the consequences of the current situation and overplay the consequences of a new situation. So better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. In one study, 85% of executives admitted they did not raise an issue with their boss at some point in their careers. 85%. That's because people did not want to provoke conflict. Nor do they want to be labelled a troublemaker, nor do they want to lose their jobs. We've got mortgages, haven't we? And also, they often said they didn't know how to resolve it, or, critically, thought it would make no difference anyway. So why bother? And the worry is, in poor economic climates, the one we're sort of going through right now, the concern over job security rises massively, so people there become more compliant because they fear what it would be like on the outside. Then we look at fragmenting and distance. The increasing complexity and interconnectedness of large organisations means that no one sees the whole. So the organisation itself is blind to the consequences of its decisions. And this is further compounded by layers of management who filter out non-conforming information from senior management. So they don't know. And then we've got the increasing tendency to bring in contractors and consultants, further exacerbates the issues as they are less inclined to raise issues, or if they do, they lack the power of influence. In the book, it talks about the tragic Challenger space shuttle accidents, which eventually was traced back to rings that were subcontracted out to Morton Thiokol. However, when Morton Thiokol did raise those issues with NASA, their concerns were brushed aside due to the political pressure upon NASA to deliver. Likewise, Primark, as did Nike, turned a blind eye to the use of child labour in their ambition to drive costs down. And finally, we know that time and distance also causes opportunity for blindness. In the Stanley Milgram experiments, only 40% of the respondents were prepared to shock the stooge with the full voltage when the person was in the room, versus 65% when they're in another room and could just hear them. Likewise, the generals in the First World War never visited the hospitals, and we can guess why they didn't. Moving on from that, blinded by money. What you bonus reward a person will drive focused behaviour towards it. That's why bonuses exist. And this can lead some people to lose sight of what's right or wrong. And evidence shows the more you get bonus, the blinder you become. So, for example, in the subprime mortgage economic meltdown, everyone was aware of the potential problem, but no one wanted to change the issue as it served everyone's interests at the time because their bonus was ginormous. So when we care more about money, sadly it means we care less about people. So what are some possible solutions to blindness? The first thing, we must be aware we all naturally bias and therefore blind to things. And we've got to see it more personally. What if that was my grandfather in the hospital? And we've got to stay in touch with average people. Money buys isolation from the masses, and many business leaders are divorced from the consequences of their actions due to their privileged world of isolation. You know, Ratan Tata, the largest employer in India, rides in the front of his car and daily converses with his driver. And Tata's motto is question the unquestionable. And institutionalized dissension allow debate of issues from a number of different angles. For example, the Vatican appointed the devil's advocate, and BA's Colin Marshall appointed Paul Birch as his corporate fool. Furthermore, run anonymous audits in the organisation so the truth can be heard. And always question the alternative, what I call the null hypothesis. What evidence do we have that this is not true? And then demand alternate solutions. Set different teams exploring the same problem from different angles. And set metrics and benchmark standards and publish for transparency. And institutionalize diversity. And simply just being prepared to ask the questions can often stop organisational blindness. Critique of the book, look, I think it's a really important concept, and I think as relevant to the days when it was first written. You can say even more so, because as the world's got more complex, more fragmented, actually more unethical, because the truth, fake truth is out there all the time. We've got to make sure that, we're doing the right things. The book is full of lots of stories, and I actually totally support, what she's saying about this stuff. So it's a fascinating book. It's quite heavy. you know, on the problem and maybe a bit light on some of the solutions. But overall, you know, I think it's a really important book that we need to look at and maybe read. I hope that's useful.